Today, global debt has reached record levels, standing at $315 trillion in early 2024. The word debt is something that's becoming a part of our everyday life. Whether it's personal loans to buy a car or a house, or borrowing money to help out a family or friend, debt is increasingly becoming how many of us manage our day-to-day struggles. Simply put, debt is borrowing money that you promise to pay back, usually with extra money on top called interest. But it's not just individuals or businesses borrowing money. Governments do it too, and at a much larger scale. When a country doesn't have enough money to build roads, hospitals, or schools, they borrow from other countries, banks, or organizations like the IMF. And just like personal loans, they need to pay back more than they borrowed before. If they take up too much debt, it can become a huge problem, especially if the economy isn't growing fast enough to cover for the borrowed costs. This is exactly the situation many African nations are in today. As of now, 9 African countries are classified as being in debt distress, meaning they are struggling to meet their debt repayments. Another 15 countries are at high risk of debt distress, and 14 more are at moderate risk. Countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Zambia, and Chad have either defaulted on their debt loans or restructured their debt recently. But why should this matter to you? If you've been keeping an eye on social media, you've seen the recent protests in countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. People are angry and frustrated about unemployment, rising taxes, and the high cost of living. These are all symptoms of Africa's growing debt problems, and unfortunately, there's more to it than meets the eye. Stay tuned as we discover how rising debt levels are holding back Africa and how this affects your everyday life. After independence, African nations had big dreams of building strong economies and improving the lives of their people. This was a new era, and they needed money to build it. Money for schools, roads, hospitals, and infrastructure. But nation building is expensive, and many governments started borrowing from international lenders just to keep up with this. By the 1980s, African countries found themselves in deep debt. Ironically, the freedom they had fought so hard for now came with a new form of control for financial dependence on foreign lenders. Over time, many countries borrowed more than they could repay, and just like with personal debt, when countries owe too much, the economies slow down. Studies show that when a country's debt reaches 60% of its GDP, its economic growth starts to decline. Many African countries have been above this threshold for decades. For a while, African countries relied on their natural resources to pay off their debt. But in 2011, global commodities prices dropped. Countries like Angola, Nigeria, and Zambia, which depended on oil and minerals, were hit hard. Suddenly, paying off their loans became difficult. But this wasn't the only problem. Internal conflicts in places like Burundi, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and corruption in countries like Mozambique and the Gambia made the situation even worse. Even countries that didn't rely on oil exports like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Ghana saw their debt levels rise due to delayed production of natural resources and issues with tax collection. One of the most significant players in Africa's recent debt story is China. In the year 2000, African countries owed China almost nothing, but by 2017, that debt had skyrocketed to $143 billion. Some countries even had to borrow from the IMF just to pay off their Chinese loans. So why is this the case? Chinese loans often come with tough terms, higher interest rates, shorter repayment periods, and less flexibility than loans from institutions like the World Bank. Today, countries like Zambia and Djibouti are at high risk of a debt crisis because of these loans. Whether you see it as a strategy for control or simply bad financial management, one thing is clear: Africa's relationship with debt, especially from China, is growing more complicated. More recently came the COVID-19. The pandemic hit economies worldwide, and Africa was no exception. Countries borrowed heavily to manage healthcare, support businesses, and protect their people. By 2024, debt levels had reached record highs, with many countries spending more on debt repayment than on critical services like education and healthcare. But the pandemic wasn't the only crisis. The war in Ukraine and conflicts in the Middle East have driven up the price of food and energy, making it even harder for African countries to balance their budgets. Additionally, inflation and currency devaluation have added to the debt burden, making it more costly for nations to repay their loans. So what exactly does this mean for you and me? It means that governments have less money for essential services like fixing roads, building schools, or improving healthcare. Therefore, less jobs and less opportunities. For example, in places like Nigeria, over 60% of government revenue goes just to paying back loans. And if things don't change, this could turn into a full-blown crisis across the continent. In order to make things better and improve the situation, Africans need to stay informed, hold their leaders accountable, and push for better financial management. Most importantly, we need to have conversations about borrowing responsibly and finding ways to reduce our dependence on external loans. This is the future of Africa, and we all have a role to play in it. Make sure you share this video to keep spreading the message of awareness. Like and subscribe to PR Network to find out more on insights for Africa in the post-independence era.